He's an assistant professor of American Studies at Barnard College, and the title of his talk is Take the Splinter from Your Eye, the U.S. Charges Genocide. And yeah, take it away, Manu.
Okay. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, all right. Thank you to our hosts. Really honored to be here speaking with you. On January 19th, in one of his final acts as Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo released a memo charging Chinese authorities with, quote, the forced assimilation and eventual erasure of a vulnerable ethnic and religious minority group. Insisting that we will not remain silent, Pompeo held, quote again, if the Chinese Communist Party is allowed to commit genocide and crimes against humanity against its own people, imagine what it will be emboldened to do to the free world in the not-so-distant future. On July 27th, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin III gave a lecture at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Singapore, charging China with, quote, aggression against India, destabilizing military activity and other forms of coercion against the people of Taiwan, and genocide and crimes against humanity against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. Moments later, Secretary Austin continued, let me be clear. As Secretary, I'm committed to pursuing a constructive, stable relationship with China, including stronger crisis communications with the People's Liberation Army. You know, big powers need to model transparency in communication. Yeah. Genocide is a charge of the highest urgency. According to a well-known analysis presented to the US State Department, only rapid and overwhelming armed intervention can stop genocide. Real safe areas or refugee escape corridors should be established with heavily armed international protection. A UN or regional rapid intervention force should be mobilized by the UN Security Council if the genocide is just starting. For larger interventions, a multilateral force authorized by the UN should intervene. In this light, how should we understand Secretary Austin's charge of genocide in relation to his offer to pursue a constructive relationship with China? The UN General Assembly unanimously adopted the Genocide Convention on December 9th, 1948, and it went into effect on January 12th, 1951. The history of the convention is usually traced to the advocacy of Raphael Lemkin, a lawyer who advised the chief US prosecutor in Nuremberg, spurred by horror at Nazi crimes within Europe. In 1948, the majority of UN member nations already consisted of Latin American, African, and Asian countries. In this perspective, the Genocide Convention can be understood as a response to the crimes of imperialism, crimes of impoverishment and racist violence. Only 11 months after the General Assembly adopted the Genocide Convention, Mao would announce that the Chinese people had stood up from a century of humiliation. Although the convention went into effect in January 1951, the US would not ratify it until November 1988. In November 1950, while firebombing Korea, US military officials began threatening to drop nuclear bombs on China and Northern Korea. By June 1951, the head of the Far Eastern Air Force Bomber Command testified to the US Senate, everything is destroyed. There's nothing standing worthy of the name. Just before the Chinese came in, we were grounded. There were no more targets in Korea. By October 1951, US B-29 bombers carrying conventional bombs were making atom bomb test flights from Okinawa to Northern Korea. On November 1st, 1952, the US successfully detonated the world's first hydrogen bomb, hundreds of times more powerful than the bombs it dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This bomb instantly vaporized an entire island in the Marshall Islands. A weapon of such magnitude could never have strictly military applications. It is by its nature a genocidal weapon. In May 1953, having run out of targets in Korean cities and villages, the US began to bomb dams, causing catastrophic flooding. Famine was only averted by solidarity shipments sent from China, the Soviet Union, and other socialist countries. In all, the US dropped 32,557 tons of napalm and 635,000 tons of bombs on Korea, which is more than the total bombs it had dropped in the Pacific during World War II. Korea, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam rank as the most heavily bombed countries in world history, and it was the US that dropped those bombs. In 1951, the Civil Rights Congress, under the leadership of William Patterson, prepared and presented a petition to the United Nations charging the US with genocide against black people. As Patterson recalled in his autobiography, within the CRC, we read and debated the provisions of the UN Charter and the conventions. Every human rights provision of the Charter, every one of the conventions on women, children, and genocide was being violated in relation to both Negro nationals and poor whites. The Civil Rights Congress petition affirmed that genocide is a matter of world concern because its practice imperils world safety. In this case, it was justified by those who demand free elections abroad, even as they kill their fellow citizens who demand free elections at home. The petition noted that, quote, the genocidal doctrines and actions of the American white supremacists have already been exported to the colored peoples of Asia, arguing that the lyncher and the atom bomber are related. Last March, an International Commission of Inquiry released a report on systemic racist police violence against people of African descent in the United States. The families of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, and Philando Castile joined 600 organizations to petition the UN Human Rights Council to appoint a UN Commission of Inquiry. Following intense US pressure, the Human Rights Council expanded the scope of its report from the US to the entire world. The International Commission of Inquiry was thereby formed to maintain a focus on the US itself. In its 200-page report, which you can download and read, I suggest you do, the Commission found a case of crimes against humanity warranting an investigation by the International Criminal Court. Citing the Rome Statute of the ICC, it found crimes including murder, severe deprivation of physical liberty, torture, persecution of people of African descent, and other inhumane acts occurring in the context of a widespread or systematic attack directed against the civilian population of black people in the US. This past summer, after the discovery of hundreds of unmarked graves at the site of a residential school in British Columbia, indigenous leaders began to demand a genocide inquiry. Over the following weeks, even more graves were revealed elsewhere in Canada. These were the graves of nameless indigenous children taken from their communities into euphemistically named boarding schools. Operating between 1863 and 1998, these so-called schools were sites of horrific violence and abuse. Following these revelations last June, a little over 1 month before Secretary Austin's speech in Singapore, U.S. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland announced an investigation into the loss of human life and the lasting consequences of residential Indian boarding schools. By charging China with genocide in Xinjiang only to offer the possibility of pursuing a constructive, stable relationship with China moments later, Secretary Austin trivialized the charge of genocide itself. The US government charges genocide to manipulate people's revulsion against racism in order to close the boundaries of popular resistance against racist wars. As the Civil Rights Congress warned in 1951, there's ample historical precedent for genocidal crime increasing against the Negro people in time of war or threat of war. Genocide is defined as a crime that targets a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. How do we define violence that targets the poor? In December 2017, the U.S. Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights visited the U.S. Again, you can download this report. I recommend you do. He reported that the immense wealth and expertise in the U.S. stand in shocking contrast with the conditions in which vast numbers of its citizens live. He found that the U.S. has 18.5 million people living in extreme poverty and 5.3 million living in conditions of absolute poverty. The U.S. has the highest youth poverty and infant mortality rates among comparable states. The U.S. is alone among developed countries in its insistence that human rights do not include rights to food and health care. Eradicable tropical diseases are increasingly prevalent. There is, the report concluded, a dramatic contrast between the immense wealth of the few and the squalor and deprivation in which vast numbers of Americans exist. In its August 26 decision ending the federal eviction moratorium, the U.S. Supreme Court seemed to provide a direct response to the report on extreme poverty in the U.S. The justices found that the eviction moratorium, quote, intrudes on one of the most fundamental elements of property ownership, the right to exclude. Taken to extremes, the Supreme Court warned the federal government could even mandate free grocery delivery to the homes of the sick or vulnerable, require manufacturers to provide free computers to enable people to work from home, order telecommunications companies to provide free high-speed internet service to facilitate remote work. The ubiquity of poverty and racism are like a splinter in the eye of US society, distorting its perspective of the world. Anyone who calls themselves socialist, anyone committed to fighting poverty, would benefit from a careful study of how China eliminated extreme poverty, how it has rapidly raised life expectancy, and how it has approached the pandemic to prioritize human life. And you can, if you missed the panels earlier, especially in the morning, you can learn about all of that. So go back and watch those videos. Having been here in New York since the beginning of the pandemic, I've been haunted almost daily by the voice of General William Westmoreland, the commanding officer of US forces in Vietnam, who famously said, "The Oriental doesn't put the same high price on life as does a Westerner. Life is plentiful. Life is cheap in the Orient." There have been 668,442 COVID deaths in the US. By comparison, Civil War deaths in the Union Army are estimated at 360,000. Before the pandemic, more than 1 in 10 children attending public schools in this city were homeless, and that's understood to be an undercount. Currently, in this city, 1 in 3 children do not know where they're going to get their next meal. US foreign policy conversation seems to have pivoted already away from charges of genocide in Xinjiang to preparing for the so-called defense of Taiwan. US strategists openly suggest that in the event of a war in the South China Sea, the US will use nuclear weapons. There's an essay this morning in the Wall Street Journal talking about nuclear barrages and nuclear depth charges in submarine warfare in the South China Sea. Within the US, opinions on whether China is good or bad are entirely irrelevant to the actual situation in China itself. This conversation is actually about whether or not to support a war, likely a nuclear war. This push to war can't be separated from the poverty and racism causing hundreds of thousands of people to die within the US, prematurely, unnecessarily. The real culprits are not the Communist Party of China or Han settler colonialism or whatever other crazy idea people want to throw up against the wall. The real culprits are here, in this city, in this country. As the Civil Rights Congress wrote, the lyncher and the atom bomber are related. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that powerful statement, Manu. Next up, we have Mark Tseng-Putterman, who is a writer and PhD candidate in American Studies at Brown University. His research focuses on histories of US empire and racial capitalism through the lens of media infrastructure. His writings on race, US imperialism, and Asian American activism have appeared in The Atlantic, Boston Review, Roar Magazine, and Monthly Review. And he'll be speaking to us today on China and the global schema of racial capitalism.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you to everyone at the Qiao Collective and the People's Forum for hosting us. It's been a really critical and invigorating day, and I'm really grateful for all the organizing labor that made it possible for us to be here together in person and online. So my brief comments today seek to put contemporary US-China relations into the long-term historical context of US empire, and I hope it will be a useful addition to the very engaging and informative talks that we've heard so far today. Specifically, I argue that what we are currently watching unfold, the consolidation of US military hegemony in the Pacific to quote-unquote counter China's rise, in fact bears all the historical patterns of 19th century US imperialist strategy. In the face of a deep popular amnesia about the history of US intervention in China, my hope is to disrupt sensational, equivocating coverage of US-China relations and to see instead how US policy continues to be guided by a deep-seated colonial mentality which views China and the Pacific region at large as a preordained sphere of US domination. In particular, I want to emphasize two key continuities between this 19th century consolidation of a US trans-Pacific empire and our current neo-Cold War moment. First, an ongoing regional calculus which views sovereign Asian and Pacific nations as collateral damage for US policy which seeks either to penetrate or contain China. And second, the lingering pursuit of the so-called open door, a 19th century metaphor to describe a policy of free trade imperialism. I argue that this open door image and aspiration continues to structure US mediation of China's engagements with the world system. So a useful entry point here is a 2018 document called the US Strategic Framework for the Indo-Pacific, which was released earlier this year by President Trump's outgoing National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien. And this document is based on several assumptions: that the US must maintain diplomatic, economic, and military preeminence over what it describes as the fastest growing region of the world, that US strategic primacy in the region represents the defense of a so-called liberal economic order and core values of freedom and liberty, and, importantly, that China represents an existential threat to the project of US trans-Pacific hegemony. And it's worth noting here that as the US continues to increasingly invoke this concept of the Indo-Pacific, that if we're to look only at the surface area of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, this is more than 1/2 of the Earth's surface, which the United States is laying claim to. And so this diagnosis calls for a familiar array of militarized remedies, which we've heard about throughout the day. Strengthening the Quad security alliance between the US, Japan, Australia, and India, promoting India as an economic and military counterweight to China, increasing arms sales to and military exercises with South Korea, and maintaining the colonial networks of affiliation which bind Pacific Island territories such as Guam, Palau, and the Marshall Islands under US political control. But interestingly, O'Brien framed this Indo-Pacific strategy with a distinct statement. He writes, quote, "The United States is and always has been an Indo-Pacific nation, from the first American trading ships that departed for China just 8 years after the American Revolution." This rare historical transparency reflects the fact that pursuit of China's supposedly limitless markets has been a defining discourse of the United States since its formation. We might remember that the American patriots who dumped Chinese tea into the Boston Harbor did so not in vague defense of liberty, but in protest of British monopolies over the wealth of the China trade. From the expeditions of Lewis and Clark to the settlement of California and the purchase of Alaska, the violent settler colonial conquest of the continent itself was also premised in no small part on access to Far East markets. Massive infrastructure projects from the Transcontinental Railroad to Trans-Pacific steamship routes and telegraph lines came together to realize the potential of the US Pacific coast as the staging grounds of a trans-Pacific commercial empire. And crucially, this pursuit of the China market helped to entrench diverse forms of US imperialism across the Pacific region and across Pacific territories framed as so-called stepping stones to the Far East. Following the illegal overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii in 1893, debates over Hawaiian annexation were overdetermined by the island's utility as a crossroads of the China trade. As the McKinley administration put it then, quote, "We must have Hawaii to help us get our share of China." And after the Spanish-American War, expansionists similarly invoked the allure of the Philippines as what they called an American Hong Kong, an entry point for economic and military access to the Chinese mainland. And as a brief aside, it's worth noting that in 1900, during the multilateral repression of the Chinese anti-colonial Boxer movement, the US actually mobilized about 5,000 military troops from the Philippines to China to suppress this movement. So this kind of military regional calculus was mobilized even in that early era. This violent trans-Pacific expansion was animated by a notion of open-door imperialism. Put forth in Secretary of State John Hay's 1899 Open Door Notes, this document was a notice to competing imperialist powers stating U.S. opposition to the territorial partition of China, instead favoring the maintenance of a so-called open colonial concession system in which British, Japanese, and American commercial interests could freely compete in treaty ports like Shanghai. While it's often invoked in the official U.S. histories as a righteous anti-colonial policy, the open door concept is better understood as an early expression of free trade imperialism, an agenda of capitalist expansion and commercial penetration without the costs of imperial invasion or colonial administration. Of course, this open door system was always a gross misnomer. The commercial opening of China was predicated on 2 bloody wars fought over the right of Western traders to traffic opium into Chinese territory. Former US President John Quincy Adams summed up the Western position regarding the Opium War when he described that the war was not fundamentally about opium, but rather China's anti-commercial stance. In civilizational terms, Adams decried what he called the, quote, arrogant and insupportable pretension of China to refuse commercial intercourse with the rest of mankind upon terms of equal reciprocity. In this case, terms of equal reciprocity meant the surrender of economic sovereignty under threat of force, as in the case of the 1844 Treaty of Wangxia, which in the wake of the First Opium War afforded the US most favored nation status and the same entitlements as the British. The threat of gunboat diplomacy nonetheless loomed large over the negotiations as a US warship was stationed outside of Guangzhou to ensure the talks proceeded apace. Fast forward a century and a half, and I would argue that the metaphor of the open door loomed large over the 2018-2019 US-China trade war. Adams' diatribe about China's anti-commercial stance would have fit right in as US trade negotiators and media outlets deplored Chinese protectionism, including its mandates for foreign firms operating in China to share intellectual property, state subsidies to manufacturing firms, and restrictions on foreign capital ownership. Like the Opium Wars, the trade war was guided by Western lust for Chinese market access and demands to erode China's political economic sovereignty under threat of force. While these continuities have been strategically silenced in Western popular and academic circles, they have often been readily apparent to Chinese observers. In May 2018, for instance, when an early draft of US trade demands circulated, detailing a demand for China to reduce the trade imbalance by at least $200 billion by the end of 2020, the Global Times published an article on Weibo titled, quote, US proposes unequal treaty with China. Is it 1840? And here I would, ask what are the kind of ideological circumstances which make these connections so readily obvious from a Chinese perspective and yet so impossible to make within Western academic and even left intellectual circles. So I believe that these historical continuities bear new urgency as economic cajolement to open China to Western capital domination are once again backed by the expansion of military encirclement of China by US and allied forces. Here, the triangulation of US militarism and colonialism across the vast Pacific region in service of an aspirational opening or reactionary containment of China continues to structure the region. Take, for instance, the Indo-Pacific Command's 2020 budget proposal, euphemistically titled Regain the Advantage, which will devote $20 billion to massively expand missile, radar, and precision strike networks in Guam, Okinawa, and Hawaii. Just this week, actually, it was announced that the US Marines were seeking to develop hundreds of acres of land in Oahu, east of the former Barbers Point Naval Air Station, to house what they call a future force. And of course, defense analysts have linked the move to the reorientation of US military power vis-a-vis China. This geopolitical overdetermination of the Pacific as a line of island chains encircling China crucially implicates movements for Pacific indigenous sovereignty, decolonization, and demilitarism amidst renewed Cold War aggression on China. It's here that our attention as socialists and anti-imperialists based in the United States must remain fixed on what we might sardonically call actually existing imperialism. While speculative charges of Chinese imperialism have dominated some left debates about China, it is not China which maintains a network of 800 military bases in more than 70 nations across the globe. And increasingly, the US invokes the speculative threat of Chinese hegemony to justify and expand this actually existing global imperial apparatus. Even putting aside normative assessments of China's political economic system, we should be able to build a broad political alliance opposing the maintenance and expansion of US empire under the auspices of great power competition with China. We must be able to see through the liberal think-speak of the United States and its sub-imperial client states who insist on their righteous defense of a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. Remember, it was under this liberal order that some of the worst crimes of the 20th century, from US intervention in Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, to nuclear experiments on the Marshall Islands, were committed. The regional calculus of American empire, in which indigenous Pacific nations are reduced to stepping stones en route to China, in which Japan's pacifist constitution moves towards possible revision to bolster regional militarization to contain China, in which THAAD missile defense systems are forced onto the Korean peninsula, all this requires regional and international resistance. At this historical conjuncture, we must link all movements for peace, decolonization, demilitarization, to see how the justification of renewed Cold War aggression with China provides cover for the maintenance and extension of a trans-Pacific American empire, which for too long has colonized the people's aspirations for peace and sovereignty across the Pacific. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Mark, for that deep historical cut. Next, we should be joined remotely by Radhika Desai, if we could pull that up. Great. Radhika Desai is a professor at the Department of Political Studies and director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba, Winnipeg, Canada. She is the author of many works, including Geopolitical Economy, After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire. And she'll be speaking, well, the title of her talk pulls no punches. It's the Geopolitical Economy, Stupid. Why many Western leftists misunderstand China. Take it away.
Thanks very much, and thanks to the Qiao Collective for inviting me. Right, so I'm going to, I should say that I'm really happy to follow on the first two speakers. I think that my talk really follows on very nicely from them. And although it is pitched in a different register, a much more abstract register, but so here goes. Oh, and I should say that I'm trying to summarize a lot of ideas in here. And if you are interested in what I say today, I very much urge you to take a look at, sorry, 1 second. Yeah, take a look at a manifesto which we have recently published, which you will find here at this website, which is simply internationalmanifesto.org. So I just wanted to put that pitch in. Okay, so let me begin. My argument is that leftists and Marxists, many Marxists, misunderstand China because they don't understand the geopolitical economy that lies at the core of Marxism. It is key to understanding the operation of both class domination and exploitation and imperialism and anti-imperialist resistance, and to putting the both of them in the same frame as Marx and Engels and the classical Marxists did. The attempt to separate anti-capitalism from anti-imperialism is futile. Both class and national oppression and exploitation are equally the results of capitalism, which I understand as contradictory value production, which is necessarily historical because the history of capitalism is driven forward in a very fundamental way by the unfolding of the contradictions of capitalism and the need of societies to manage these contradictions and, of course, to manage resistance to capitalism, both from classes and nations. In addition to the class struggles that arise from capitalist competition and exploitation and shape capitalisms historically, geopolitical economy stresses that capitalism is also enmeshed in contradictions at the world level. This is the level that Marx called, this is the level of what Marx called the relations of producing nations. And China's socialist revolution and its economic rise are part of the historical unfolding of the dialectic of uneven and combined development that governs these relations, the relations of producing nations. Though normally the idea of uneven and combined development is traced to the opening chapter of Trotsky's history of the Russian Revolution, the ideas, if not the label, are already there in Marx and Engels' work and are widely shared by later generations of Marxists. Indeed, a version of these ideas was part of the Bolsheviks' understanding of their revolution. Marxists, or a lot of Marxists today, tend to misunderstand this. Most Marxists never use the term uneven and combined development. Many others who do use it, they use only one half of the term, namely uneven development, to denote international and interregional inequality, perhaps to denote imperialism. Those who do use the term combined development as well tend to confine it to instances of socialist revolution in backward countries that, as they see it, seek to leapfrog over the capitalist stage. In reality, the meaning of what Trotsky termed combined development is actually much wider. Like class struggles, the dialectic of uneven and combined development, essentially the competition and struggles between nations, is also rooted in capitalism's contradictions. They make developed capitalist countries expansionist, that is to say imperialist. They must subordinate other countries, whether through formal colonialism or informal subordination, and open them up to their excess commodities and capital, and so that they may supply cheap resources and labor. When successful, such subordination maintains the unevenness of capitalist development by creating and maintaining relations of complementarity between the high-value production of imperialist countries and the low-value production of those countries that they seek to subordinate. Since such subordination usually arrests development and consigns countries to poverty, the countries that can resist do resist, and their resistance takes the form of engaging in what I call combined development in the broader meaning of the term, which refers essentially to state-directed development that also carefully manages trade and financial flows in ways that assist the development of the forces of production. The overall aim is to reject the relations of complementarity that imperialism could impose and to create relations of similarity. Only such development has spread productive capacity outside the places where capitalism first developed, not the spread of markets and certainly not imperialism. This was the story of the development of the first countries to challenge Britain's dominance over the world market, namely the United States, Germany, and Japan. To these instances of capitalist combined development, in the 20th century, Russia, China, and other socialist countries added socialist combined development. Such publicly controlled capitalisms and socialisms have made the world progressively more multipolar, or as I now prefer to call it, and after the late Hugo Chavez, they have made the world pluripolar. That is to say, there are not only many poles of power in a sense of productive power, but also that each one of these is organized quite differently in its own national fashion. Socialist revolutions have so far taken place only outside the homelands of capitalism. No doubt because the spoils of imperialism have permitted capital to make greater concessions to working people at home through welfare states and other concessions. This feature of capitalism's geopolitical economy has tended to make large swaths of the left, even the Marxist left, Eurocentric and pro-imperialist, going back to the days of the Second International. Whether they recognize it or not, they have accepted imperialism as a condition of social reform. This explains why it is often the case that it is parties of the left in the imperialist countries that are often the most enthusiastic imperialists, such as, for example, the Democratic Party in the United States. They clothe their support, of course, with with discourses around civilizing missions or free trade in the 19th century, or today in the 20th and 21st century, promoting democracy and freedom, promoting human rights, the responsibility to protect, and now, of course, with the Biden administration, the so-called rules-based international order, as though the United Nations did not constitute and the entire system of states created after the Second World War did not constitute some of the most effective rules of the world order. But of course, these being more genuinely multilateral are not useful to the United States. They would rather make their own rules. Though 4 decades of neoliberalism have undermined social reforms achieved by the Western left in the imperialist homelands, these institutions have not entirely disappeared. However, thanks to anti-imperialist resistance, imperialism has been on a downward trajectory since 1914, as not coincidentally has been capitalism. Already then, capitalism had reached its monopoly phase, at which Marx had argued it would have exhausted any historical progressiveness it ever had and would have become ripe for socialist transition. Indeed, the post-war golden age of capitalism is more or less entirely accounted for by the fact that socialistic measures were adopted in the form of welfare states, public ownership, and regulation. Since that golden age, the options of capitalism and its imperialism have been consistently narrowing. As capitalism, even in the imperial heartland, ceases to offer working people significant concessions, as it claws back more and more of the concessions that had been made during the golden age period, class struggles can only intensify in the capitalist heartlands. This is why it is urgent not only for China, but for Western working classes to begin to understand the actual historical evolution of capitalism on a world scale, of which China's revolution and rise are such an essential part. Revolutions like China's have not only had to establish social justice and equality in considerable measure, but also to develop the forces of production, to do so in the face of unremitting imperialist hostility, and do so in ways that can never resemble the development in the imperialist core, because it has to be done without any contribution from imperialist gains. This is the task that the Soviet Union attempted and achieved in good measure before the historic experiment was wound up by reactionaries within it, and what China is achieving today. A significant amount of capitalist combined development has taken place in other third world countries. It was certainly enough to give rise to the talk of the BRICS in the early 21st century. However, it is also clear that such capitalist combined development in the third world is best advanced by governments oriented towards popular welfare, and the recent turn towards governments committed more single-handedly to the interest of capital and to that of the highest echelons of corporate capital in countries such as India and Brazil have set back their growth and industrialization very considerably. That is why the growth and development of the forces of production in socialist China is so much more consistent and so much more sustained. After the golden age ended, chiefly because its growth remained reliant on capitalists and their capricious investment impulses, neoliberalism was supposed to restore capitalism's vigor. It never did, because it could not. The virtues of competition are irrelevant to capitalisms that long ago entered their monopoly phase. Today, the bankruptcy of capitalism is clear even in the imperialist homelands, where it can only exist by creating ever greater economic and social inequality, indulging in speculation rather than production, sacrificing people's lives for profit, particularly as we see in the context of the current pandemic, and unleashing the most violent forces of ecological destruction, despite the low growth that it has experienced over the last 4 decades of neoliberalism. This sort of capitalism can offer the rest of the world a future that is even bleaker than what it today offers working people in the imperialist countries. Socialism, one therefore that works for people and the planet, has never been more urgent. And it can only come through people taking control over their economic destinies, each in their own way, creating a pluripolarity of reformed capitalisms and socialisms united by a common anti-imperialism. This pluripolarity is the necessary path to socialism. So I think I will end there for today. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Radhika, for that excellent analysis. Our final speaker on this panel is Pawel Wargan. He is an organizer based in Berlin who serves as the coordinator of the International Secretariat at the Progressive International, and his talk is entitled Learning from China. So, Pawel, if you want to take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers, thank you to the sponsors, and a happy belated birthday to the People's Forum. I really wish I could have been there in person. Now, since it's midnight in Berlin, I thought I'd mix up the register a little bit and start with a slight detour. I was born at a really strange time in Poland's history. It was March 1990. The Soviet Union would collapse just under 2 years later, and Poland had embarked on this sprawling and radical program of privatization that really set the stage for its later politics. The view that I always had of Poland growing up was that before the 90s, it was a great place. I always imagined it in black and white for some reason, where the walls listened to your every word, where every neighbor reported every other neighbor to the authorities, where everyone was poor and the only cheese you could come by was came as aid from the US. Apparently it was rubbery and orange and largely inedible. Of course, the Polish People's Republic committed many failures. No one's saying that things were perfect. But what struck me in hindsight is that these failures were all that I was allowed to know. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the histories and experiences and accumulated bodies of knowledge of socialist societies behind the Iron Curtain have been effectively erased, or cloaked behind these highly reductive concepts of the police state or the authoritarian state, which gradually made way to the kind of hollow triumphalism of freedom and of democracy, words that themselves ended up dissolving into reaction because they held so little substantive content. And so to this day, I'm ashamed to say that I have an impoverished understanding of my own country's history from 1945 to the year of my birth, and I'm slowly plugging the gaps. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, how much am I allowed to know about China if I know so little about the socialist history of the country of my birth? And thinking back to just a few years ago, I realized how little I knew. I only ever spent 2 weeks in the country. Most of the information I had about China was drawn from the liberal media, which offered, a mix of vaguely comical or downright racist stories about ghost cities, subway stations materializing in empty fields, a looming market crash, this omniscient system of social control and surveillance that was also apparently designed by deeply incompetent bureaucrats, and so on. You know the kind of narratives. And over the years, I think many of these stories for me began to collapse just under the weight of evidence. Sometimes all it took is threading a story through to its conclusion, or clicking on the URL in a BBC article and reading the source. But new narratives continually emerged, always entirely divorced from the broader historical and geopolitical context. And what remained constant under the surface of these stories is the same mechanism that denied me knowledge of my own nation's history, which is this highly reductive framing that explains every misstep, every mistake, every failure, whether true or not, as a stain on the system as a whole. This, by the way, is true of China, it was true of Poland, it was true of the Soviet Union, and it's true of all nations that the US designates as adversaries, especially socialist states. And that framing has cultivated or contributed to a tendency on the Western left to treat policy failures within socialist countries as evidence of total and irreparable systemic flaws, while at the same time the loss of the revolutionary horizon, the loss of the historical and dialectical, of the materialist and dialectical method of understanding history has reduced many to hoping, really against hope, that the systemic features of capitalism, the exploitation, the warmongering, the inequality, the destruction of the environment, and so on, can be repaired through policy interventions or staged protests or elections. You know, we've gotten to a point where we're allowed to celebrate the concessions that produced the US's deeply flawed COVID relief bill and its $1,400 checks, even though that same bit of legislation included hundreds of millions of dollars in funding for regime change operations in scores of countries around the world. You can Control F your favorite US adversary and you'll find money designated to destabilizing its government in that bit of legislation. But you're not allowed to celebrate China lifting over 800 million people out of poverty through a set of policies that is far more complex, far more nuanced, and far more successful than any that the US proposes to put forward. China is not allowed nuance, and socialism is not allowed nuance. And to me, this mode of relating to the world, this mode of relating to other countries, is incoherent, it's parochial, and it's ultimately disempowering. It's incoherent because it treats other nations' political systems as monolithic, thinking and acting with one mind so that any mistake casts a shadow on the whole. You know, this is a standard that we don't apply to our own governments. This mode of reasoning is parochial because it excludes the possibility that people outside of the West hold a different perspective that is valid. You know, one of the things I discovered learning about socialist Poland is that we are remembered fondly by the people in the global South. Polish architects, for example, joined hands with architects from a number of countries, from Congo to Iraq, to build social housing, to plan cities, to establish schools of architecture, grounded in local traditions, led by local people. These relationships opened a fundamentally different development path for nations that were just emerging from colonialism. As Max Eil said in one of the earlier panels, the same is true of China today. For people across the global South, the fact of China being able to develop as a sovereign and prosperous state in the context of imperialist encirclement holds promise for their own economic sovereignty and prosperity. And I don't feel it is within my right to question these perspectives because I don't live those realities. And finally, I find that mode of thinking disempowering because it deprives us of the opportunity to learn from the historical processes of China's development and the theories underpinning it. You know, my own turn towards Marxism began when I was a climate activist. I was part of this group of activists and researchers, and we wrote these excited articles and extremely long reports about the promise of a just transition. If only we could invest 5 trillion euros here, create 5 million jobs there, invest in repairing the legacies of European colonialism. And it really didn't take long to understand that none of these proposals, none of these ideas that we had conjured up had any prospect of realization. Why? Because we had no theory. And because we had no theory, we had no concrete strategy by which to address the core deficit at the heart of the systems that we were targeting. Namely that you can't vote capitalism out. You can't will capitalism out. This is why, in my mind, studying processes of revolutionary construction in China and elsewhere is so important. I'm not interested in this or that person's opinion about whether China is or isn't socialist. And China isn't interested either. I'm interested in understanding what in the 100-year experience of China's revolutionary process we can learn from to help animate our own struggles. Studying revolutionary processes teaches you that you cannot just will capital away. It teaches you that contrary to this popular idea that we can leapfrog past revolution to a world of global climate justice or whatever, the process of constructing a new economic, political, and social model in a world dominated by capital is difficult and riddled with challenges and requires organization and requires building institutions. Now, I am a Western leftist, if you allow me to lump Poland in with you guys. And ultimately, my obligation is to challenge the systems here in Europe that sustain deep levels of deprivation around the world while impoverishing Europe's workers. Not many people know this, but there are over 100 million people at risk of poverty or social exclusion in Europe today, about 1 in 5. 10 years ago, the European Commission set itself a target of reducing that number by 10 million, and it failed. In that same time, as we've heard from Ting's Chak in the first panel and from others, China lifted tens of millions of people out of poverty through the mass mobilization of its society, through programs that include peasants and the poor in developing and the design of these programs of poverty reduction. Now, will I learn from the model that succeeded, or will I choose to learn from the model that failed? Now, take even something like environmental policy. On a per capita and cumulative basis, on a historical basis, China's emissions are dwarfed by those of the US and the EU. It's not even close. And under every international climate agreement, developed states have an obligation to do more because they contributed more to climate destruction over the course of history. Yet in the past decades, China has contributed more than any other nation to the reforestation of the planet. Last year, it installed half of all renewable energy capacity globally. And as we heard again from speakers before, it's engaged in mass environmental restoration projects that create millions of jobs. Now, am I going to study the model that is producing material outcomes, or am I going to study the model that isn't even trying? And so my position is very simple. We stand to gain a lot by shifting from a mode of confrontation to a mode of learning. For leftists of all traditions in the West, learning about socialist construction, learning about China's transformation from a deeply poor feudal society to a moderately prosperous spacefaring one in one lifetime, can teach us something valuable about the nature of socialist construction and the challenges that it must confront. Just as me excavating my own nation's history can teach me about the conditions of socialist construction there. And that, in turn, I think can sharpen our politics, can strengthen our strategy, and can clarify our obligation as leftists living in deeply inhumane societies in the imperial core. And that obligation is to dismantle these systems that continue to deny humanity its liberation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Pawel. Yeah, that was a personal sort of connection that you drew that I found deeply resonant personally. So we actually have a lot of time for questions, something from 20 to 25 minutes. And so if you allow me, I would like to start with just one question as the moderator. And I know all of you have a bunch as well, so I'll limit myself to just one. Yeah, just sort of referring back to the title of the entire panel, we're talking about the Western left. And I think, when we do so, it's important not to treat it as a monolith or even, all those different tendencies within it that are broadly, critical of China for one reason or another. We know that there are critiques coming from anarchist angles, Trotskyists, Maoists. And I think it behooves us, within the Western left, which we are, at least by virtue of location, to really understand sort of where they're coming from so we can better engage and advance our understanding of China. And so to that end, this is actually going to be kind of like a meta question of sorts, and I don't sort of expect any of our speakers necessarily to answer like the entirety of it. But you know, sort of what I'm interested in are what do you think, or in what ways do Western left critics of China align with sort of bourgeois critics, or ones that are, you know, manifestly behind, you know, the imperial aggression against it? To what, in what ways do they differ? In what ways do they sort of differ from each other, right? In terms of emphasis, at least. And then, you know, sort of a secondary side question to this is we refer so often now to a new Cold War, and that brings to mind that there were also large segments of the Western left that were quite critical of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc in the original Cold War. And, you know, so my sort of sub-question there would be, you know, what are the similarities? What are the differences? Are they down to like the different developmental models of the USSR and China? To what extent are they down to you know, the racialization of China as an enemy? I know that was a lot, so, you know, if any of you just have like a single thought on one point, I'd be curious to hear that. Maybe it was too much, I'm sorry. Sorry about that, Radhika. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you've raised a lot of really interesting questions. And first of all, let me agree with you that obviously the Western left is quite complex. One should not, you know, homogenize it. But having, so you know, all these people who are attending the People's Forum are clearly not part of that Western left. So it's a very complex category. But I think when we are criticizing the Western left, we're referring precisely to those people who in the past rejected third worldism, who today continue attacking China in the name of anti-imperialism and say that we have to be, you know, anti-capitalist and completely reject the understanding of the centrality of imperialism. So I just want to say maybe partly, I mean, I hope you don't think I'm sort of advertising myself and my own works, but as I've tried to puzzle through why is it that there are all these tendencies on the left, one of the important conclusions I've come to is that going back a very long way, beginning even in the late 19th and early 20th centuries already, there has been a tendency on the part of left of Marxists to try to fit Marxism into neoclassical economics. And without going into too many highways and byways, let me just say this has created an understanding of capitalism as though it is a self-contained and relatively contradiction-free system, even though Marx stressed contradictions. And it has also therefore created an understanding of capitalism. Let me rephrase that. I think it has created a Schumpeterian understanding of capitalism as constantly innovating, prodigiously productive, Promethean system, rather than one that has historically tended to stagnation unless states have organized imperialism and other ways of resolving its tendencies towards stagnation. So, and today, so that's what significantly accounts for it. And what happens on the left is that the gains of imperialism are mistaken for the dynamism of capitalism. And so I think we have to undo these trends. And once we do that, we will realize that, you know, these actually existing socialisms are actually productively superior. If you consider the great obstacles against which they have developed the forces of production in China today, in Russia in the past, etc., and in many other countries, I think that's what needs to get through. And I think today, we have a very interesting opening, a very interesting aperture in this project of removing these sorts of misunderstandings, because capitalism is manifestly inferior. Capitalism has performed less well. Neoliberal, the more neoliberal and capitalist your country is, the less well it has performed against the pandemic. The harder it's going to be for these countries to emerge out of the pandemic, etc. Whereas socialist China or socialist market economy China has actually been, you know, has essentially resolved, at least on its own territory, the pandemic, and it is continuing to power ahead. So So to come back to the point, I think that we have to undo the damage done by neoclassical economics, which is accepted even by many people who call themselves Marxists. So I think that's the first thing that has to go. So I will end there for now.
Yeah, Manu, would you like to
Sure. I mean, I think it may be too much to ask, but you know, if we discard anti-communism and racism, then you know, how do we approach a country like China or understand or study a country like China or a country like Cuba or Venezuela? Again, it may be too much to ask of those anarchists and others who live here. And then there's another, you know, there's, I think, something really pedagogical of the last couple of years. The Financial Times has been writing articles about China, you know, writing things like, you know, China's quote unquote zero tolerance policy towards COVID has cost it economic growth, which tells us a lot about how life is valued respectively in the different systems, in the different countries, especially, you know, that hits a certain way in New York. So I think I agree. There's something objectively true about, you know, you can use tests and isolation and tracing and, you know, pretty much get the pandemic under control. The public schools in the city just opened last week. They're testing less than they did the year before. There's already been, I think, 200 cases in the schools. These are kids who can't get the vaccine right now. So again, where is life valued and where is life not treated with value? Where is science and technology used towards, you know, flourishing or at least staying alive?
Thanks, Manu. Mark.
Yeah, I'd like to try to speak to your question about, you know, the extent to which there is a convergence of rhetoric and opinion on China between, you know, Western left and right-wing factions. I think that there is clearly a very deep alignment, particularly at the level of rhetoric. I mean, we hear everyone from Mike Pompeo to, you know, anarchists or democratic socialists saying they're in solidarity with the Chinese people. And often, or almost always, that pledge of solidarity is used to distinguish, you know, their hatred of the Chinese government, the Communist Party of China, from this abstract Chinese people that they are, you know, in solidarity with, which, on the one hand, you know, is, I think, reifying this kind of Orientalist trope that Chinese people are slaves to a despotic government rather than, you know, active political agents in a revolutionary process. And on the other hand, I think that, you know, this rhetorical convergence belies ultimately a policy convergence. And so what I would ask for, you know, when we so often see, you know, the simple kind of political declaration of no Cold War on China, which ought to be, you know, a pretty simple, common sense, anti-war position. That statement alone is now met with, you know, all sorts of vitriolic and often, you know, from the left, quote unquote, attacks about everything from, you know, human rights to repressive COVID responses in China to, you know, what about Chinese workers? And I find it interesting that those responses sides up the question of, you know, do you want a new Cold War or do you not? You know, in what ways does your solidarity with the abstract Chinese people lead you to, you know, whether implicitly or explicitly endorse US containment policy, sanctions on Chinese firms, migration bans on members of the Communist Party of China? And so I have yet to see a compelling theory of change for people who profess to be in solidarity with the Chinese people that does not ultimately kind of just provide discursive cover for you know, the consolidation of US imperialist aggression on China. And I think it's important to note that you know, these conversations, these critiques don't happen in a vacuum. And as many speakers have eloquently pointed out today, you know, in a context in which we're very relentlessly being bombarded with certain messages promoting war and conflict and demonization of China, coming from, often traced back to the Pentagon, the military-industrial complex, and their various spokespeople in mainstream media. The critique, the leftist critique of China is not operating in a vacuum, and the question is, what kind of left debates about China are useful in a context in which this escalation of war and containment is happening so rapidly, and which are really providing kind of a way to sidestep the issue and to remove oneself from a very clear anti-war, anti-imperialist stance and kind of disavow, the reality of Cold War escalation.
All right, yeah, thank all of you for your really insightful responses. So audience questions, I think I saw you up in the front row raising your hand earlier.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been an amazing day for me, but I guess kind of in an effort, we've talked about how the US has used the NED, right, and efforts to use either autonomous regions as a reason to intervene in Chinese, relations, or, Xinjiang, Hong Kong. And now the latest one that I think we're probably going to be hearing about a lot more is its South China Sea tensions between two other countries, not autonomous regions or anything like that. It's going to be like the Philippines and another socialist country, Vietnam. Do you think that China will either cede that whole tension and go further into their Belt and Road Initiative, or what other implications do you think that might have in the future in terms of its economic development towards the rest of Western Asia?
Radhika?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm happy to start this off. You're asking a lot of very complex questions, but let me just say that, so obviously, the Western US-led hybrid war against China remains at a very high pitch. Everybody thought that when Biden was elected, that this was going to be this would be lessened, etc. But very soon it became very clear that actually Biden is continuing Trump's policies in one field after another with just minor stylistic differences. So I think that that's certainly, so that's going to continue. And I think what this has done is, basically, in fact, going back to the 2008 financial crisis, I mean, people always exaggerated the extent to which China's economic development was based on exports to Western countries. It was never that dependent. And even what dependence there was in terms of exports, very soon the party state more or less immediately engaged in an enormous expansion, first of an investment stimulus and then later of a consumption stimulus. So since that time, China's economy has become much more a kind of self-sustaining. Its growth has become more self-sustaining, independent of exports to Western countries and so on. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that therefore more recently, the introduction of the so-called dual circulation model has also been very important. Thirdly, I think that China's strides in the technological field, etc., is going to earn it more and more other trading partners. And in any case, the US, I should also add one of the things we have not really talked about, although we're talking about imperialism and anti-imperialism, is the huge turning point that the withdrawal from Afghanistan constitutes. It's a milestone in the decline of American power. In many ways, it is more humiliating for the United States than even the withdrawal from Vietnam, etc. So all of this means that essentially American power is receding. And in its place, I think China's influence, China's investment, China's Belt and Road Initiative, the Asian Infrastructure Bank, etc., China's credit, all of these things are actually already beginning to create a very different world. So it is not a surprise, for example, that the majority of the world's countries now have China as their most important trading partner. So in all of these ways, a change is already afoot. What the United States is doing with this new pact with the United Kingdom and Australia and so on is simply trying to fight a rearguard action against a reality of its slipping power that it cannot reverse. It can fight, it can throw tantrums, it can, put many warships in the South China Sea, but I don't think of course, there is always the possibility of some mad decision being taken, which would put the world in a very dangerous place. But by any rational calculus, if the United States would hesitate even to attack a medium-sized country like Iran, there is no way that they can seriously, rationally contemplate a war against China. But that doesn't. But at the same time, and you also have to understand that in the United States, the war actually does not. The United States has not won a single war, if you think about it. So the fact of the matter is that when people cite these astronomical statistics about American military spending, it changes year by year. At one point it was, more than all the rest of the world combined, right? And then this statistic changes here and there. But the fact of the matter is all of this money is being spent as much to shovel money into the military industrial complex, to allow defense companies to make money, as it is for any serious war objectives. In fact, the confusion of the two, to maintain the military industrial complex and to fight wars, means that America is hopelessly confused about what it is doing in any theater of war. So all of these things should be borne in mind. Meanwhile, I think, as I say, barring some madcap decision by some madcap decision maker in the United States, I think China's growth, its own domestic economic growth and its prosperity will continue. Its wide influence will continue to widen. The only danger is the following. Because China is a socialist market economy, because China has a substantial number of capitalists within it, including some very rich and powerful ones, the only danger is that if they were, and I don't think this is likely at the moment, given how much their power has been reined in, but it is possible that a powerful constituency within China manages to change China's direction in a neoliberal and capitalist direction. If that were to happen, that would be a big danger to China and the rest of the world, to China's people and to the people of the rest of the world. But beyond that, as I say, I think more recently, the party state has certainly controlled it with the recent, for example, calling Jack Ma to account and so on. So we know that these things are, at least for the moment, they are definitely in control, but that would be the only serious danger that we may contemplate. So we can expect China to continue growing. And I would say also internationally, in terms of the tensions being stoked up by the United States, I think China has, generally speaking, acted very responsibly. It has acted not by responding equally aggressively, but by simply ignoring, on the whole, the empty saber rattling from the United States.
Great. All right. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Radhika. Thanks to all four of our panelists on this panel and all of our speakers previously. We are unfortunately going to have to cut off the Q&A there for timing reasons, but at least two of our panelists are here in person if you want to talk to them later. And for now, though, we are going to take another 10 minutes or so break before our closing keynote by the inestimable Vijay Prashad. So.